Gitanjali Dang is a curator and writer, but mostly calls herself a shapeshifter, and I have questions about that term, which we will take up, intriguing as it is. In 2012, she founded Kanabadosh, an itinerant arts lab. Um, it's been a real pleasure to follow, also from a distance, Gitanjali's work in terms of writing, inventing all kinds of formats, again, outside of the spatial constraints of exhibition making, taking leaps into fictive conditions of productions, and also thinking very much, though, through public space and interventions in public space. So there's a whole range of practices that her platform has collectively undertaken, and she will share from that. Khanabda Dosh, she describes, lives off latitude, agnosticism, and magic, and is interested in everything, but particularly interested in constantly rethinking what it and everything around it is about. In 2015, Gitanjali, in collaboration with the Institute for Contemporary Art Research, Zurich University of the Arts, co-founded Draft. And perhaps we will hear about Draft as well. I, again, found it an extremely important and vibrant model that actually brought together practitioners from several cities of the world, and again thought through, beyond the logic of the symposium, what kinds of collaborative thinking can take place when convened in the style that Gitanjali and her cohort imagined for this form. A lot of her work also has been interdisciplinary right from the outset, referencing poetry, the history of science, and knowledge modes carved by polymaths. And I look forward to your presentation, Gitanjali.
That was so nice. I almost want you to make the presentation for me. Thanks, Natasha. Natasha, just a request. How long do I have? I have till 7, is it? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh,
so you
okay.
have around 35 minutes.
Okay. So, okay. Will you just like holler at me at the halfway mark, please? That would maybe help things along. Okay. This is a bit confusing for me. Yes. Okay. The next slide, please. So this is the Kanabadosh website, which I kind of sabotaged a couple of days ago. It's the only address Kanabadosh has. Kanabadosh is a sort of an itinerant lab. And so in a sense, this is, it means, let me just clarify this for those who might not know already what the word means. It means those who carry their homes with themselves. So, while we carry our homes with ourselves, on ourselves, it also here is an address for Kanabadosh, and I kind of sabotaged it. So in the absence of that, I thought I'm just kind of going to go through some slides. The idea, when I first received the lineup of speakers, of course, I was fairly daunted, actually. I mean, who wouldn't be, seeing as I was sort of literally the only person in the lineup who hadn't curated a biennial. And then I kind of sent the email that Experimenter sent to me, and I sent it to my mother, and she called me up promptly, and she's like, everything looks great, but why is your bio so small? So obviously this wasn't doing very much for my confidence either. And then I kind of looked at, towards Pratik and Priyanka and Pratik. They thank you for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here. And of course, I also accepted it immediately. And I sort of, I took heart from the fact that they had, in fact, invited me for a second time around. So it was like, for this Top of the Pops edition. So that was somehow heartening. Also, just to quickly, stop here and thank also the experimenter crew for sort of a superb job. Coming back to my being daunted, right? So I think I was daunted, and I realized that I'd continue to be daunted till the time I decided I didn't want to be daunted anymore. So I sort of looked around some more, and then it occurred to me, I was looking at the lineup, and then it occurred to me, and then I thought, is it possible? Is it possible that my position in the very last of the 4-day symposium is because, or the hub is because, they're kind of very strategically saving the best for the last. I know, right? If my presentation is not going to be good from here on, I'm going to have hell to pay. But next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to get on with it because I have obviously some representing to do for fish off my fry. Yeah. So when I got the invitation, it was very clear to me what sort of the broad context in which I would be speaking. It was in 2012 that I started this kind of itinerant lab called Khanabadosh. And if you read my questionably short bio, you'll notice the sentence where it says Khanabadosh lives off latitude, agnosticism, and magic, and is interested in everything. This bit about magic is a kind of an in-joke. I guess not an in-joke anymore, but this bit about magic is true for Khanabadosh because that is still around. It's nothing short of magic. Just despite my earnest efforts to kind of run it into the ground every now and then. How did it happen? I was at Coach on a residency, and at the time I was somehow unendingly whining about wanting to start something, but being held back by circumstances, as is often the case. And and once the circumstance was a lack of space. Where can one drop an anchor? If you were around at the time, you probably hear me mutter about like, oh, Clark House is a nice space. It would be nice to have a space like that. So a portrait of a curator is a big baby, if you will. Anyhow, Pooja Sood at the time, she sort of, she kind of just brushed all my complaining aside, and she said that, why do you need a physical space? Just start something anyway. And then I was like, yes, of course. I mean, this is, it was strange that it had not occurred to me. Sometimes there's something right in front of you and forever you're looking at it, but you just don't realize. And this is what had happened here. I had just not noticed the obvious. But now that I had noticed, it was still 2 years before Khanabadosh actually sort of, was born. So it was a bloody birth. There were 2 restrictions that I kind of somehow put into place. One would be no space, and the other would be no raising funds. I mean, it's not etched in stone, as you will see, that there is a huge breach of restriction, and you'll see which project caused the breach. With these two broad restrictions came a certain amount of freedom, but also precarity. Lots of it, and maybe the two are related. I don't know. Somehow on a bad day, this would translate into how far can you go if you let go, and on a good day, this would translate into how deep can you dig if you begin to dig. The curatorial has always been, for me, a way in which sort of thoughts and ideas are are metabolized, a way of making sure that they don't sort of move and pass through me without, being digested. At its best, it's a transformative process. Then at some point of time, I felt like this was not happening anymore. There was little energy formation and certainly no transformation. And so Khana Badosh was meant to put the spark back in the curatorial. I mean, this is just one kind of thread in looking at how and in looking at why certain things have come to be so in my own life and my work. There are, of course, there are multiple reasons. I mean, in a more very practical way, it felt like if I wanted to make something happen, or if I wanted to continue to do something that I enjoyed, then I just, I have to simply just make it happen. Also, and it could also be seen as like a child that's sort of banging their feet and like, I ain't gonna toe your line. What are you gonna do about that? So there are various ways of looking at this sort of this coming to be, as it were. If the crux of the ethical is curiosity and investigation, then it must also encompass the possibility of being wrong, and this should hold true as much for the self as for the collective. This possibility of being wrong was missing. Everything, I felt, everything was sort of lionized, sacralized, advertised. Every affinity had to be sort of performed to perfection, performed threadbare. And the demand for this perfection is a kind of cruelty, right? I mean, even to be sort of a kind of epistemological violence, if you will, and a hallmark of systemic capitalism. And I felt like if I continued down the road, then I would miss out on transformative possibilities of the curatorial, which is a huge problem, right? Because this is what somehow sets, to a certain degree, sets the intention, right? The subliminal context one hopes one can transmit in turn to the viewer. The idea was to to do something that would extend limits, to muck around, to set things into motion without knowing the outcome, to work with uncertainty, to make peace with contradiction, to be agile, kinetic, not ossified. To remember to not be reverential and yet to make room for trust. It is with considerable love that I can say that I learned all of this and more on the job, as part of the job. So in a sense, this idea of being interested, which is there in the bio, it's really strange for me to keep referring to my bio, but now, it was really hard to arrive at it. So maybe it's sort of partly precious for that. Being interested in everything. Someone else said that before I did. Doubting everything. Someone else also said that before I did. And everything is a trust fall. So the tension between these three sort of propositions sparks a lot of what happens at Khana Badosh. So I encourage you to doubt everything I say, but also to trust, much like I have doubted and trusted you simultaneously over the course of the hub. Could we go to the next slide, please? Next. That's right. No, usse pehle wala. Yes, perfect. Okay. I recently encountered this this somehow heartbreakingly beautiful Durva saying. Durva is a language of the Durva tribe, which is sort of in central India largely. And I learned of it through the work of Madhu Ramnath. And Madhu's work is kind of interesting for me from two perspectives. One is the fact that Madhu actually went to live. He was living in Bastar in the general area for over a decade and a half, for sure. I can't be precise. And he's a botanist, And he goes to live there, and he adopts the language, and he learns, of course, the Durva language, but also he kind of rids himself of the language of Linnaean taxonomy, and in some senses takes on a language that is more intuitive. So this was one thing that sort of I found interesting in relation to just Madhu and his work. But also, when looking at the quote, I think that I'm kind of, how does one live, right? Perhaps to be in constant dialogue with space and to figure out one step at a time and when to take up space and when not to take up space. Could also language be understood in the same way, i.e. when to take up space with words and when not to, how to sort of avoid a sort of smoothness of discourse and it's sort of not a hair out of place on pointness. I stopped writing. I used to write a bunch of catalog essays before Khana Badosh, and I kind of stopped writing them, mainly because I found that I was repeating myself. And so I still write occasionally, but when I'm given carte blanche. And the thing that now I've kind of started adopting, and this is something that also enters now the curatorial work in the future, is this. I have written about sort of work or an artist's work without actually referring to the work or referring to the artist. The first time I was invited to do something like this, or just was given an open invitation, was by Vivan and Geeta in relation to one of Vivan's exhibitions. And they said, do what you want. And I thought to myself, yes. And so I wrote a kind of a text, a fiction, which kind of really did not refer to either the work or the artist. And it seemed to work somehow, I think. It's not as bad as it sounds. Language is critical to the curatorial. Writing is critical to this process of metabolization. It creates friction, it's labor. Sometimes when I'm writing, it feels like I'm picking up words and putting words down. It's sort of almost physical in that sense. Language is to me, one of the most affective tools at our disposal. But there's also a lot of saturation as a result of it. I mean, there's a lot of talk of saturation in relation to images. This keeps coming up with regard to images, but what about sort of a semantic, this phenomenon called semantic satiation, where, words stop meaning something to you because of the number of times they are repeated. So in a sense, much like the camera, steals your soul. Then the repeated performance of deeply held beliefs for a complicated ecosystem that demands such performance is depleted meaning for me. Sort of ideas became sounds. So how does one speak about what one wants to speak about without necessarily spelling it out in a manner such that you become part of the problem? If you were writing a letter to your friend or a friend who is struggling, what kind of language would you use? What would the tone be? If you're writing a letter to yourself or a version of yourself in the future who's struggling, what kind of language would you use? Maybe there's a clue there. There's also a clue possibly in Emily Dickinson's poem. And she writes, she says, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to children ease, with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind." I mean, it's a sentimental poem, or romantic poem, but then again, sentimentality maybe conceals the complexities of life. anyway, you must take it with a sort of a pinch of salt. After sort of having said all of this and having explored this kind of way of writing and thinking, or trying to find a way to write and think, one realized that there isn't a single way, and you have to sort of constantly keep adapting. And one such possible way offered to me, and this is sort of, I've realized this only in the recent past, is through a process of storytelling. And I'll probably, you probably get a sense of what I mean by storytelling when I get to the related project. But now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to scoot. Okay, so this is going to be kind of like a real rush thing after that slightly long preface, because I wanted to present just like a 2 or 3 projects, recent ones. But then I realized that there were certain things that we had done long ago, like at the start, like in 20, I think Something to Chew On. Could we move to the next slide? Yeah. So Something to Chew On was in 2013, yes. So what was Something to Chew On? And I realized that a project like this somehow was ongoing in a sense. I mean, not ongoing because it says so in the date, but for many reasons. And I'll just quickly tell you why. So as part of the project, Mona Gandhi would organize a meal of sort of uncooked food and challenge her guests' attitudes and assumptions. The meals sort of consisted of raw, unprocessed, plant-based food. The project, was an invitation to examine everyday food choices, questioning individual and collective assumptions, beliefs, and practices. Through an inquiry into nutrition, can we interpret our relationship with body and the earth? As we ingest that this was kind of the broad idea behind the project. There was supposed to be it was supposed to be on for a year, but I think we kind of did only just 7 iterations, and the project traveled. Could we just see another the next slide, please? I have so many pages open here. It's just dazzling. Yeah. And the next one. Oh, maybe we can go back to the other one. Okay, good. So the project traveled across the city, and we did a bunch, and sort of engaged with various venues and people and all of that. But we stopped, and now begins the more interesting thing. We stopped, and Mona and I have been interacting during this time. And at one point of time, a couple of years ago, we had a discussion about how we had outgrown this idea of sort of just raw food as nutrition. Oh, no way. Okay. So essentially, they had grown out of this idea of raw food, just raw food, right? But Mona had already sort of been exploring different things by now. And one of the things, to just broadly call it, is sort of an agenda of biohacking, so where you kind of essentially take more and more charge of your health. And I've somehow been sort of more and more attracted to this agenda, especially since maybe last couple of years. And it seems that the project, while it may have ended in a certain way, it continues for us, and it becomes particularly sort of salient in a moment such as this idea of sort of taking charge of oneself. This is, of course, a privilege, and so one kind of looks at it through that lens immediately. But if you have the privilege, the idea of taking charge of your health, and the understanding somehow that the agenda of capital is only to make the agenda of capital your agenda, and so somehow preventing us from taking charge in a sense. And it's been quite kind of interesting to have these conversations, the ongoing conversations now, especially in this time of Corona. I think Natasha mentioned the word protocol yesterday, and there is, in fact, Mona shared with me something that's called a COVID protocol. It's sort of prevention and cure. It sort of, it spreads, as you know, I share it with people who, with friends who are also artists, that too. Maybe this can be something to talk about later. Okay, may the next slide, please. And the slide after, please. Next one. Okay, very quickly, Campuswala. This project, maybe we can also move again to the next slide. Yeah. Yikes. Okay. It was the marine clam, Arctica islandica, has a lifespan of more than 500 years, making it one of the longest lived animals. So Campus was sort of drawn to this, to this idea Campuswala is a researcher of history and science, history of science and math. And so he was drawn to these creatures, being as they are, sort of metaphor-rich creatures whose shells actually present a chronometric etching of evolution. And so studies suggest that the patterns found on the mollusk shells on the Arctica islandica, the bands on them are in fact occasioned by tides, which are controlled by the gravitational pulls of the sun and the moon. The temperature of these waters acts on seashells, turning them into material archives of cosmic forces. And sort of using this as a sort of as a broad idea, the Campuswala, through this exhibition, extrapolated on the idea on the connectedness of outer space and deep sea. Yeah. Next slide, please. This exhibition happened in, I mean, there's a lot to say, there's no time, but this is, it happened in actually a little studio, like a recording studio in Midtown, which is part of a bigger place called Sitara Studios. And yeah, that's all I'll say for now, I think. ठीक है, आगे बढ़ते हैं. Next one. Okay. Love in the time of choleric capitalism. This was somehow when I kind of started to maybe connect the dots a little more on the idea of sort of storytelling. The exhibition came about when I came across a story actually in a magazine, and it was a story about Saidul Hasan Qadri, you know, who lived in what's the town? Dubai. He lived in Dubai, which is in the outskirts of Delhi. And so Raul Irani, who's a photojournalist, he kind of did the story around the fact that how Saidul Hasan Qadri was constructing what people, and also perhaps he, was calling a Taj, sort of a Taj Mahal. And he was constructing this for his wife, Tajammul Begum. She died, and then one of her wishes was that, well, not one of her wishes. When she died, she sort of expressed the fact that no one will come to their graves, to Saidul and her grave, because they didn't have children. So he kind of promised her that he would construct her a monument where people would come. And so then that's how he started to construct this monument. When I read this story, I was also reminded simultaneously of a poem I had read many years ago. It was written. It's written by Sahil Ludhianvi, and the poem is it's called Taj Mahal, and in which sort of Sahir, you know, who's a leftist sort of poet and a lyricist, he kind of urges his lover. He says, you know, "Mere mehboob mujhe kahin aur aakar mil." He urges his lover to meet him someplace else other than the Taj, because the Taj is the sign of one emperor's vanity. And I thought this was an interesting juxtaposition. Well, that's really like blah way to say it, but I thought that there was an interesting kind of tension here between on the one hand the story by the poem by Sahir and the story of Saidul Hasan Qadri. Add to that, there were so many other things, but I kind of just maybe highlight one thing or two things because the exhibition was pieced with through the artworks. Okay, so just to go back a little, this is how it works, right? Like I kind of created like a kind of a story out of these various elements that I sort of researched and found out. And then I shared the story with the artists. And then as the exhibition, just the story. And as the exhibition, as time progressed, newer things entered, of course. It accrued meaning as we went along, and the artwork sort of opened it up in many different ways. But the idea through any and all of this is also to kind of keep in mind the kind of the frictions that are there. And one of the interesting frictions, there are two interesting frictions that I just want to quickly highlight here, is that so Sahir wrote this poem, Taj Mahal, which is a sort of, he's deploring his lover and the Taj, etc. And then there's a few years later, he wrote the lyrics for Taj Mahal, the film, and there's none of this in that, right? So here he's like all gung ho about the Taj, and that's really interesting. At some point in time, Faiz Ahmed Faiz entered the mix, and there was this. There's of course Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat, which is also part of the exhibition, where it's a work by Anant Raina and M.K. Raina, and it enters the exhibition. Maybe we can move a little ahead. The next slide, please. Yeah. The next. Yeah. So this happened at What About Art in their kind of small, in the front room of their office space. And it was a pretty kind of small exhibition. And so that there is sort of Zora Sehgal, reciting the Faiz Ahmed Faiz poem. And then a little later, I realized that there is, the Faiz words, Hum Dekhenge, which we are all kind of now very familiar with, were actually, that he had actually taken them from a Ludhianvi poem, and that he had never credited him for. And I'll leave you with that. Next slide, please. So there were two iterations of this exhibition, which is sort of very rare in the sense of Khana Badosh. This one happened at JNU at the invitation of Rashmi Sawhney. And it was a kind of an expanded version of the exhibition. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah, next. This is happening in the gallery that is part of the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU, right? Maybe Lorena was invited to the triennial here, and she was a participating artist, and as part of that, they took her across to as a visit to the Taj. When she got to the Taj, she realized that there were that the shopkeepers around the Taj were protesting about I think a hike of fees in the entrance, etc. And so she came back, and at the kind of the ceremony, the prize distribution ceremony, she created like a piñata, and then just as announcement were made, she kind of burst the piñata, and it contained like this currency which says what. Can we zoom in on that? Is that possible at all? Yes, some things have no price. So it was kind of a subversion. Okay, next slide. I feel like I'm on a game show and I need to like reach the end. Okay, next slide. Draft. So a draft happened in collaboration with the Institute of Contemporary Art Research, Zurich University of the Arts. And it was, I'm just going to kind of maybe very quickly tell you about the structure. It kind of, and in just like the idea with draft was to explore what public debate what public debate meant in the various contexts. In our case, there were the cities of Bombay, Cairo, Cape Town, Hamburg, Hong Kong, Mexico City, Shanghai, St. Petersburg, and Zurich. And what public debate could mean in these contexts, or what it meant, and how artists could contribute to it, where there wasn't any, or generate, how they could contribute to public debate, if at all. And so it opened with, and so we had there were collaboratives in each of these cities. It's hard to sort of go through everything, but I can say that there was a collaborative in Bombay, and that collaborative still exists, and a collaborative in the form of Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte and Camp and Khana Badosh. And so there were similar collaboratives in each of the cities, and each of these collaboratives kind of, the project went on for a year. It's still ongoing in the sense we are kind of now at the stage of publications. And there was a conference in Bombay, and this was perhaps one of the most heartening things for me. Next slide, please. In a sense, because Bombay rarely has there was someone mentioned something about discourse being missing. I mean, I feel like it's really missing in Bombay. Delhi definitely has better luck with this. And so this was really nice to bring all of these people down, or sort of 45, 50 sort of thinkers, artists, philosophers, historians, and to be able to create a kind of space where basically people shared and also kind of laid out the path to what was going to happen over the next 1 year. Okay, next slide, please. And what happened was that a lot of each collaborative kind of approached it in their own way. Basically, there were workshops. The broad idea was workshops that would eventually lead to a work. And then there would be the other conference, the closing conference in Zurich. In the case of Mexico City, they kind of put up a kind of a sort of a theatrical symposium, which very quickly, which kind of the work in the end and in the symposium were talking about this idea of a sort of a saturation level, in a sense, reach with images. But in relation to Mexico City, this was images of extreme violence, which had been kind of triggered as a result of the students disappearing in the Ayotzinapa incident, right? So this somehow formed the trigger. And how do you address these images that you are somehow saturated with? Next slide, please. And so that was a symposium, and then next, yeah. So that was a symposium, and then the work that followed, I'll tell you very quickly about that. It was that they created montages, video montages, and these were kind of inserted onto sort of the programming of the university, the UNAM University channels, also on YouTube, kind of strategically kind of inserted. And that was the work. This is a work by Alia Musallam. She was part of the collaborative in the Cairo, but her work happened in Alexandria. The work really was a deep, was looking at a certain point in history in Alexandria. This was, I'm just going to pull that up. This was in the 19th century when sort of the shipping industry and digging of the Suez Canal caused a huge boom in Alexandria, and there were sort of people coming in from everywhere. There were a lot of ideas. There was sort of a lot of questioning happening in Alexandria across cafes and theaters. This was also a period when sort of borders were less rigid, so passport regimes were sort of not in place, which meant sort of Italian anarchists and Syrian artists could flee political and religious persecution at home and come as stowaways on ships sort of across the sea. Theaters, as a result of all of this, sort of theaters were kind of buzzing with productions which were reenacting revolutions from all over the world, and audiences were invited to sort of be part of the productions. There was a lot happening, and there was a sort of a huge kind of archive there that needed to be explored in relation to this kind of period in the history of Alexandria. And so Musallam's project was a kind of workshop which kind of addressed this. Next slide, please. Yeah, Next, please. This is a work by, so now we're kind of moved from the workshop, we've kind of moved from the conference to the workshop stage, and I'm just like jumping a little bit. And this is 5 minutes, got it. And this is a work by Gitanjali, and he's from sort of the Beijing collaborative. And this work is called, it's a fantastic work. I mean, I really enjoyed it. It's a video, and it really just involves the protagonist kind of just moving across landscapes, Beijing, and sort of the outskirts of Beijing. And he has this drill, and and it's kind of maybe like over 40 minutes, and he's kind of just walking around, moving. He's sitting in, there's a scene where he's sitting in a bus, and he's kind of drilling into the seat ahead of him. He's drilling into the toilet seat, his bed, and he's just drilling holes. And that's sort of the film. Next slide, please. This was a closing conference in Zurich. I won't dwell very much on it. Next. Next. Next, please. Yeah, maybe a very super quick glimpse at R&R. So as part of the obviously I'm being biased to what we did as part of draft, but it's also something that's I have the closest understanding of, right? So maybe we can just scroll just very quickly through this page. With this, the idea was we've kind of started a space as part of the sort of initiating a project here in Bombay. We started a space called R&R, which is in Mankur, amidst a sort of it's located in a rehabilitation colony. I mean, this is kind of a sort of more sort of, I guess, politically correct way of calling it. It's a colony that happened when the certain slums were demolished in parts of Bombay, and people were somehow moved to these, to move to these kind of resettlement and rehabilitation colonies. Also, colonies that were created by the demolition of slums across the city. And so there's a colony here called Lalubhai, and this is in the M ward, is sort of suburban Bombay, and we wanted to set up a space here and to see what we could possibly do here, what place we could make here, what place people living in Lalubhai could make with R&R. We've done a bunch of things there. One of the main sort of aspects of the space so far, or energies, has so far been as a library, and yeah, we've been kind of a bit struggling with the lockdown situation, but we'll be back soon. Yeah, as you can see, that's the library. Okay, next, because I want to talk about the other one a little bit, the last one, all of the above. No, sorry, the one before that. All of the above, none of the above. Okay, so while this happens, I can just tell you, this project happened as part of my residency, because everything is sort of, there is no plan with Kanabadosh. It's always somehow, when something catches wind, it catches wind, and then off you go. So this exhibition happened as part of my residency at Oka. Just to tell you, while you look at this extremely beautiful video that was made for us, I mean, this is for the exhibition by Hilde Malm. So the exhibition is happening in a venue called Mela Husset. It couldn't happen at Oka for whatever reasons. And so when I was invited for the residency, the thing that what can one possibly do, of course, etc. I'd always been interested in Knut Hamsun's work, and I read Hunger, which I thought was a sort of become remarkable and crackling book. And so, but Hamsun is a fairly contested figure in the history of Norway. He's sort of considered a traitor because he sided with the Nazis. And I mean, there is a lot there to be spoken about in relation to Hamsun's legacy. He's also a Nobel Prize winner, etc. And so there's this one story, right, of Hamsun, and then there was another story which turned up, which is the story of Harcharan Chawla and Purnima Chawla, and Harcharan Chawla and Purnima Chawla were passed for like the first wave of kind of migrants who went to Norway, and there they kind of settled down. This happened in the 70s. They kind of settled down. They were both, Purnima was a teacher while she was in Delhi. Harcharan was with the railways. They both moved there, but they both had a sort of a literary life. Harcharan was a writer and a translator, and so was Purnima. She wrote poetry. So from the time, so then there was this one interesting aspect that happened in their case, was the fact that Harcharan, Purnima Chawla started, okay, just give me a minute so I finish this. They translated, they kind of embedded themselves in the literary scene there over the years, and they kind of became part. They learned the language, and they one of the things they did was they translated Victoria, which is a story by Hamsun. We don't know why they translated it, and considering all one knows about Hamsun. And the thing about Hamsun is that Hamsun's book Pan suddenly moves from Nordland, which is a sort of, broadly speaking, Sami territory, to India. And so we were faced with these two mysteries, so to speak. And over the course of 1 year, I, in collaboration mostly with Kush Badwar, who's part of this exhibition and one of these artists, and also other artists, we kind of tried to find our way into this mystery of the idea was never to find really any answers. We didn't find them, but over the course of 1 year, it was just everything, every direction, from schools they taught, Purnima taught in, to the museum, Hamsun Museum in the north of Norway, to like everything that we could possibly cover was covered. We had a Google Drive, which people could access. The artists who were part of the exhibition, it was shared. It actually quite took off. These things don't often take off. Okay, I'm going to stop. And that was really, we worked on it for a year. We approached it as a kind of that's Kush's work right there. We approached it as part of a kind of a mystery to solve, or not to solve, but just to kind of find our way into, and then the resultant exhibition. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gitanjali. In the draft conference, somewhere you mentioned the term homegrown artistic interventions. And I wonder what this stands for you in terms of the fact that the practices are highly localized, and at the same time, you're moving across several cities. And the fact that it starts with this sort of convening, which then kind of there's a metabolysis in a way into practice. But if you could share a little bit more, I mean, you gave a few examples, but what is this homegrown nature of your sort of role and artistic relations that you can in this case?
Did I mention that just now? Did I say homegrown?
It's part of your draft conference description.
You've been doing detective work yourself. Okay. I don't really, somehow I'm not quite sure in what context it's been said there. But from what you tell me, I mean, and I could just talk in general maybe around it, was the idea was that we worked on it for over 1.5 years, and it was, it seemed that we wanted to kind of arrive at a structure that was that was as considered as it could be. By considered, I mean it took sort of various problematics that we see of sort of, people moving around, sort of artists being sort of parachuting into places, doing things that we wanted to kind of keep various things into mind, things that we are sort of, we are aware of in, say, in the context of a globalized art world. And yet we wanted to kind of have these cities speak to each other. So this, I mean, as a structure, this seemed, I'm not sure if it is, if it's interesting, if it will continue to be interesting in the future. But at the time, it seemed like, as a structure, that it would be nice. I mean, the conferences were also to bring people together, because there's a certain energy, right? I mean, we're here now, but everyone's been kind of talking about being together in a space, right? So there is a certain energy that is generated by, bodies in proximity, minds in proximity, I think sort of synapses, kind of flying. And so that the conferences were really to create that kind of proximity. And also, I mean, it really was very important for me to have something like this in Bombay, in a sense. And then the idea was that while, these things, you have a kind of ideal version of how you'd like it to be. And the ideal version was that everyone would continue. We had a kind of the website had a sort of a back end where people could access and continue to interact. But these, because of just the nature of lives and work, a lot of this may not have happened exactly the way we wanted to. But what did happen was that, like I can speak from the perspective of, say, us in Bombay, right? Now there are these three, say, disparate situations, people, points in time, whatever, who have now been pressed together, right? And I didn't know them. I mean, it's interesting that, because we often say that, people coming together who already have kind of affinities, and we did, of course, generally speaking, there are affinities. It's not like there aren't any, but we were not in any way thick friends or anything. But it's been an interesting process of coming together. And that was really, I think, that's been interesting for me personally as part of Draft. And I think something like this may have also happened elsewhere. I could go on, but does this somehow answer the question?
Sure. I mean, we're in a time where a lot of arts organizations are likely, unfortunately, to lose their spatial, their spatial conditions, whether that is a rental space or whether that is a historic building that's been given or granted, even losing structural support, which leads to not being able to have a physical space. And as you said, for you, Khana Badosh became this kind of online platform that is both host and guest, in a sense. And I'm wondering what advice you might have, for smaller scale arts organizations that perhaps are making this transition willfully or under duress to having a more itinerant existence. And I mean, just personally, I've also realized that in Sri Lanka, for us, we don't have a physical space. We work from actually our home and various institutions around the city that might, host us for meetings, etc. So I'm wondering really how this notion of infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, can exceed the space.
Oh, that's, I don't know. I mean, I want to think about it, but do you have any thoughts about it in the meantime, from your own experience?
I mean, this is the thing. I feel there are institutions actually around the world, whether it's in Beirut or Cairo or, even Berlin, there are important arts organizations that have lost their physical spaces. And so I'm very conscious of the fact that we do need to think about how our practices can dislocate but relocate effectively and keep the communities together, the audiences and the communities in dialogue without that spatial arrangement. And so this is, this would be sort of my invitation to you to respond, because Khana Badosh is an itinerant space that exists online and with different arts, like where JNU, the School of Arts and Aesthetics, might host a show, or What About Art? So if you could talk a little bit about that. Okay, Gitanjali's laptop has just lost battery. So I'm talking to all of you. Zasha, would you like to step in by chance to share about this as a response while we wait for Gitanjali?
Sure. I mean, I'll try.
Come in on video, Zasha.
Sure. Give me a second. I'm so implicated in this as well. I mean, Clark House lost. We didn't lose our space, but after 9 years of being hosted, we decided to grow up and try to find our own space. And pay rent and grown-up things like that. We started, as you know, kind of squatting, but it was a friendly squatting of an antique storage space. So, you know, the artists who are now directors of Clark House have done a brilliant job in finding another space very close to Kona in the periphery, not the periphery of the. I want to periphery of the national park. It's a very interesting space to be in. But before that, we actually were playing with ideas of just being hosted by the tea shop, you know, hosted by the Ganpati festivals that used to happen outside Clark House, especially. Sometimes we would really, when we had Clark House, we constantly looking for ways to enter public space and not ask for permission. And one way was to enter processions, enter even trapeze artists, you know, who were performing outside on the corner. And the tea shop, we would use their spaces. They were so hospitable to us, and we could never have got permission to do that. But these were structures already, you know, people who knew how to work with the city. And so it was, yeah, sorry, Gitanjali.
No, please go on. Speaking of precarious, precarious infrastructure, my laptop, really precarious. Anyway.
I'm going to switch, but I just want to say I appreciate so much this point, also the sense of refusing to, refusal is also interesting in Gitanjali's practice, refusing to adopt certain art system practices, and maybe in the refusal you realize how much there is. So I stop here.
Thanks, Zasha.
So Gitanjali, I'm not sure how much you caught of my response.
No, I didn't catch anything.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I do think if you still wish to comment on this question, which is really around the fact that a lot of arts organizations, smaller scale, independent organizations, be this in, you know, even bigger cities that have an immense cultural scene, like from Berlin to Beirut to Cairo, are undergoing the loss of physical sites. Sometimes out of choice, sometimes out of you know, obligation and under duress, all kinds of reasons. So would you like to share certain, perhaps just, you know, notes from what it's meant for you to work in this itinerant way over the last couple of years, and especially since you were last at the Hub?
Yeah. For better or for worse, one of the things that happens, at least this was, perhaps this was also a conscious decision. This might not be the case with others who might sort of adopt or be forced to similar kind of way of functioning. Like I said in my presentation, it offered a certain freedom, right? And the freedom is the freedom from, like, you don't have to constantly produce, right? You can take your time. You can give time. you can let things marinate. There isn't a sense of sort of being obliged to do things because you have a space. So the idea of this kind of constant productivity is dialed back. But that's kind of, so here's the thing, right? Even as I say this, I'm also aware of just the other side of this, which means that, especially in my case, the idea was that it's not, I thought that once that Khanabadosh could be some kind of collaborative, but that never happened because somehow there was just no energy around it, and I didn't think there was no need to force it. Which in my case means that despite there is this freedom from and this dial back and the sense of production, etc., it also means there's already this idea of precarity, because I can't speak for other organizations, because in my case I haven't raised any funds apart from draft, which is a sort of so funds have to come from elsewhere. Where they come from is another question. There is this dialing back, but there's also precarity, and there's also a sense of I'm losing my chain of thought. I did lose my chain of thought, sorry. Yeah, maybe I can come back to that.
Okay, I have another related question, and then we have 2 questions from the audience.
Sure, yeah.
Could you describe, your nature of, say, in certain ways, making detours or digressions from the sort of mainstream art community, this shape-shifting as you write? Are there specific activities that you're committed to that mean that you are somehow also withdrawing from a specific cultural scene? Or do you coexist but choose to do so on your own terms? I mean, I'd just like to clarify that aspect. And I also wanted to bring up for the audience, and I wonder if you've come across this.
May I just say that maybe I can speak to this question and then go to the next, because maybe it might be too much. I might not be able to respond. In this sense, I mean, if you're talking strictly in the sense of, like, if you look at the term shapeshifter, or in the sense of engaging, my curatorial practice is a part of what I do. I consciously make the effort to engage in other things. So when I say shapeshifter, it's somehow also this is pretty much what I have in mind. While I enjoy what I do and I have committed to what I do, there are also other things that I like to do, and I like to be sort of in a sense various that way. So yeah. That's where the
that's where the curious about what those things might entail, but any case
or what those things might entail. I mean, I enjoy I have been trying to write fiction for a very long time, and so this is something that takes up a lot of my time, trying to sort of feel you think writing is sedentary, and then you realize it's almost like physical labor, and so I've been trying to do this for forever. Also, what else? I'm interested in being in a sort of a more performative practice, but not, and I've done this. So it's happened in relation to, for instance, the exhibition Love in the Time of Choleric Capital. When it's the Delhi iteration, I made a kind of a performative lecture around at the time. And this was one aspect of it. I'm also interested in exploring other kind of more, I mean, although writing is physical, as I've said, but I'm literally interested in exploring more physical sort of practices where where I can think differently, which engage my mind in a different way, be it music, which I'm also interested in, but I've done a bit of acting, and that's kind of interesting for me because it makes me use my mind in a certain way that I do not get to use when I'm curating. It's a kind of a meditative process, sort of in a sense, because you're constantly aware of your body in so many different ways. So yeah,
Thank you. Great. I was also just wanting to share, with the audience, because I was inspired to think about this specific book, which is by Martin Herbert, called Tell Them I Said No, which reflects on various artists who have withdrawn from the art world or adopted an antagonistic position towards its mechanisms and distribution networks. And because a large part of obviously the arts community is about sociality and also a calibrated kind of presence. So, the aspects of retreat, refuge, rejuvenation, but also rejection are, really, I think, interesting for us to renegotiate and rethink at this kind of time, at this space of impasse and saturation. So that was just, more a comment from my side to sort of share in the spirit of your way of working.
I just want to maybe interject a little bit there. Maybe I've the fact that the idea, I mean, with Khana Badosh, let me just speak from that perspective, is to just one step at a time, whatever happens next, and we take like the next step is the next step when you get to the next step, and one doesn't know what that is. There isn't, I mean, there isn't kind of necessarily a refusal to engage with the art world here. There's none of that. How does sort of being with it and yet sort of finding your own way around as to how you might function, because I don't think it's possible to be completely outside of any system as such, unless, of course, you take on a really, really radical route, and I'm afraid that that's not me so far. So, did you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah. No. I guess I'm not meaning a hard line refusal. It's just an interesting kind of way in which one works on one's terms. Yes. And I think it's just interesting how certain artists have also created that space around themselves, which is one of refuge, which is one of maintaining various kinds of linked practices that feed their creativity. So I was just calling that forth.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
I'd like to simply just ask on behalf of two audience members their questions. Rohit Goyal comments that your vocabulary of curation embraces, and this is his reading, identity politics, love, personal experience, biography, bodies, and then those local bodies coming into proximity elsewhere. Is that right? Zasha's curation seemed to be deconstructing an identity politics for the sake of reimagining place, human bodies, to form new imaginaries of place from a different present and future that doesn't rely on static experience, identity, body. Would you like to comment on the part that pertains to your work?
Yeah, it was just sort of fascinating that the first thing that I think Rohit has mentioned is identity politics, and this is something I'm personally extremely sort of, while it is important, my relationship with it is extremely sort of. I keep it at a distance from myself in my own practice as much as possible. It's not avoidable, and so but if Rohit looks at it that way, I don't really know, even during the course of my presentation, if I in fact actually there was any of that. But if Rohit is looking at it that way, then he is, I guess, looking at it that way. Because I personally, the only thing I can say is that. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe because it is my perspective. It's biased, so I don't know. Maybe there's something more to it that I must reflect on. But I know that for a fact that I try as much as I can to not enter that kind of territory of identity politics in a very overt fashion. Yeah. I can't hear you, Natasha.
The last question is from Nabina Gupta, who asks,
Yeah.
you spoke about transformative possibilities of curatorial practice, and your idea of constantly adapting and selecting the process of storytelling. Gitanjali, how do you perceive working with community and engaging with current challenges of inequality, social justice, and also the work with R&R in terms of socio-spatial realities, public housing, and so forth?
Yeah. So this is what I was this is what I was trying to somehow get at, as to, in terms of a language, and as a curator, I don't necessarily want to approach, say, enter a room with XYZ. This idea, that idea, that idea, that idea, be it the idea of decolonization, be it the idea of housing, be it the idea of whatever. In the case of draft, it is distinctly there, but in general, otherwise, I'm more interested in somehow making a proposition, and then how does this, and this proposition, of course, this is where I suppose the curatorial, or my being a curator is activated, right? Because in the story that I kind of invite into my life, and then consequently into the lives of the artists. So I mean, if I am now sort of inviting sort of the story of Sayyidul Hasan Qadri into my life, because I think it's a sort of a beautiful, but sort of also sad, and there's sort of many things into it, right? I didn't mention this in the talk because there are just so many things. But like, for instance, Qadri's no more. He died a couple of years ago, was sort of hit by a scooter or something. So there are these stories which are ongoing, and I'm just trying to tap into an ongoing story, and then inviting it, and then to see. Literally, when I invite artists, literally it is the story, and then the unfolding of the story and the meaning, the production of the meaning happens through the artist's works. And this is somehow for me a fairly sort of enriching process. I get to learn because I mean, when I look at a story, obviously we are looking at, there can be no single translator of a story. This is a problem, right? So to me, to say that this is what the story means is problematic. But then sort of a whole bunch of us come together, and which is why of late it's somehow, like even within the kind of group of the artists, and that we're working together on an exhibition or something, there's a joke like there are lots of people by now. But it's interesting, right? If there are a lot of artists thinking about the same story and bringing in as many possible perspectives to it. So that's somehow how I, and of course, all of this is in the story. It is implicit in the story, It is implicit in the story of Sayyidul Hasan Qadri, the idea of, say, a monument, What does it mean to construct a monument? It is also implicit in the story. What does it mean for a Marxist poet to possibly snatch a line from another poet who is an important figure in subcontinental poetry, to take a line from someone else and not acknowledge it. What do these small acts mean? And these small acts are collected through the duration. These situations are collected through the duration of the exhibition. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gitanjali. We'll be concluding now, and then look forward to everybody joining us in the shared conversation and the audience questions that have not been answered. We'll be also taking them up. So thank you, everybody, for staying with us towards this last segment, and to Gitanjali for her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Natasha. Sort of a fantastic job.